Now, the rest of the story. Lillian was always being asked about the origin of that romantic custom, and always she had to reply that she did not know. But then one day Lillian decided she would discover how it all began. And 7 decades ago, her research concluded, and the conclusions of historian Lillian Eichler comprise the rest of the story. The names of the people involved have long since been forgotten, likewise precisely when. Suffice it to say that it happened once upon a time. The young miller was well known and well loved in his hometown, which was in Holland. He was chronically poor. Now, do not misunderstand. This miller was a hard-working fellow, may have been the most industrious member of his community, but he had a weakness, a soft heart. Whenever one of the townsfolk was in distress or in need, the young miller would come to his aid with money or bread or flour. And yet such a great friend of the poor was he that he often found himself one of them. And then one springtime, this young miller fell in love. The young lady was quite beautiful, although in any case the miller thought so. The problem was, her father was one of the few townspeople who did not admire the miller's generosity. Anyway, he, the father, had another man picked out for his daughter. He had a prosperous pig farmer picked out, a pig farmer with a herd of more than 100. Now, one imagines the inevitable conversation between father and daughter. Probably it followed the familiar lines of reasoning. First, the daughter protesting Dad's insensitivity to her feelings, her future. Then the father's stern resolve to prevent the mistake of his little girl's lifetime. It is her life, the daughter says. She is too young to know what is best, the father says, and so on. Until finally it was apparent that the stubborn young lady would have her way no matter what. To which the father replied that if she was determined to be poor in life, she might as well get a head start. So there would be no dowry for her wedding. There would be no dowry for her wedding. Now, it's a credit to the girl's persistence that she accepted her father's ultimatum, and she promptly proceeded to make plans for the ceremony. But that was only the beginning. You remember all of those needy people whom the miller had assisted with gifts of money and bread? Well, when they learned that he was getting married, when they learned that the bride's father so disapproved that he refused to present the traditional dowry, they, the miller's friends, decided to put together a dowry themselves. Their gifts were not extravagant, a Dutch vase, a few plates, a bit of linen, a new pot, but these friends assembled with their presents, and they went to the girl's house in a happy procession, and they gave the gifts to her. You might say they showered her with their gifts. This spontaneous Dutch treat, this tribute to a young man's generosity and a young woman's love, was what initiated the custom of the bridal shower. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. In this episode, Mr. Harvey explained that because the bride had no dowry, due to the kindness shown by the groom, friends showered the bride with humble gifts. Now, dowries may seem old-fashioned to most of us today, but they're still an integral part of the marriage ritual in some countries. A dowry is most often thought of as a payment in cash or property paid by the bride's family to the groom or his family at the time of marriage. Dowry is an ancient custom which predates written history. Some of the earliest known writings mention the custom of dowries. The Code of Hammurabi, a 4,000-year-old legal text created in ancient Babylon, described the dowry as an already existing custom. According to the Code of Hammurabi, only sons inherited from their father's estate. Therefore, dowries were a way for fathers to provide for their daughters. A husband could count the dowry as part of the family assets, but the husband had no say in how the dowry was used. The wife was entitled to the dowry upon her husband's death. If she died childless, the dowry was returned to the wife's father if he was still alive. If the father was not alive, her brothers and her brothers only divided the dowry. Her sisters did not inherit portions of her estate. Upon the wife's death, the dowry was inherited by her sons in equal proportions. The wife's daughters did not inherit. In most cases, females inherited nothing. In ancient Greece, dowries dated back at least to the 5th century BC and served as a form of protection for wives from ill treatment by husbands and in-laws. With the dowry, the husband had an incentive not to harm or kill his wife. If the wife died within a certain period of time after marrying, the dowry would be returned to her family. In the Roman Empire, dowries were called dos. The dos was property that was transferred by the bride or on behalf of the bride to the groom or groom's father at marriage. All other property owned by the bride continued to be her own property unless she donated it willingly to the groom or groom's family. In the Roman Empire, it was customary for the bride's family and friends to pay promised dowries in installments over 3 years. Romans were praised for delivering the dowry in one lump sum. In China, dowries typically included land, jewelry, money, a collection of fine clothing, sewing equipment, and various household items. From ancient history until just a few years ago, only sons inherited property upon a father's death in China. The dowry was the only way assets were transferable from father to daughter. A daughter's dowry was kept separate from the groom's property, and in rare cases, the dowry was transferred from the bride to her daughter. Now, in many European countries, a common penalty for the kidnapping and or rape of an unmarried woman was that the abductor or rapist had to provide the woman's dowry. This was called wreath money or the breach of promise. In Russia, land dowries were common. A Russian advice book written for the upper classes in the 16th century included advice on setting aside property for the purpose of raising a dowry. This property was used to enable the father to accumulate linens, clothing, and bedding over time rather than buying them all at once just before the wedding. This would lessen the impact on the family because dowries were expensive. If the daughter died, the dowry was usually given to the poor. Over time, dowries evolved from tangible items into dowries of cash money. In England, single women had the right to own property equal to men. However, following the Norman conquest in the 11th century, property owned by married women had to be held in the husband's name, custody, and under his ultimate control. If the husband died before his wife, which was common, there was a widow's dowry, which included 1/3 of the husband's lands at the time of marriage, his income, and in some cases, the management of the lands. These were assigned to the widow for the rest of her life. Under the English dowry system, marriageable daughters were a valuable commodity to ambitious fathers. For an aristocrat to marry, the father of the bride had to pay a considerable dowry. If the father could afford the dowry, he could change the family status and move them up into the upper class. The benefits were many. In 1800s Victorian England, dowries were seen as early payments on a daughter's inheritance. By the late 1800s, the custom of dowries began to fade away in England. In the United States, the dowry custom was brought by colonists from England, and they share the same basic pattern. During the 19th century, daughters of rich industrialists who could legally inherit large amounts of money and property were given dowries by their fathers to enable them to marry European aristocrats who had a title but little wealth. This mutual exchange of title and wealth was beneficial to both bride and groom and their offspring. For instance, in 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt, only daughter of Alva Vanderbilt, member of the rich and famous Vanderbilt family, married against her will, I might add, Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough. Consuelo was secretly engaged to American socialite Winthrop Rutherford. Consuelo's mother begged at first, then ordered Consuelo to marry the Duke. Consuelo made plans to elope. When her mother learned of the plans, she locked Consuelo in her room, and Alva threatened to murder Rutherford. Still, Consuelo would not agree to marry the Duke. Then, Consuelo's mother's health began to decline quickly. As her mother seemed to be nearing death, Consuelo finally agreed to marry the Duke. Consuelo's mother's health miraculously improved. The Duke was deeply in debt and in love with another woman in England, but he ended the relationship with the woman he loved and married Consuelo to get the dowry, $2.5 million. Now, adjusted for inflation, $2.5 million would be about $92 million in today's money. Wow. Shortly after the marriage, the Duke purportedly told Consuelo that he only married her to save Blenheim Palace, his ancestral home. Blenheim Palace was also the birthplace and home of Winston Churchill, the Duke's cousin. Winston was 3 years older than Consuelo, and they became good friends. This is a photo of them together outside Blenheim Palace in 1902. Whereas dowries have faded away in most countries, the practice continues in India. In Patna, India, Ruby Devai married a shopkeeper. For 4 years, Ruby's in-laws constantly beat her for not bringing a bigger dowry to the family. When she was unable to come up with more money, gold, land, consumable goods, the family tortured her. Ruby explained with tears trickling down her cheeks. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law would beat me up. They would grab me by the hair and drag me around. They used to hit me with whatever they could lay their hands on. Her father-in-law often pinned her arms behind her while the others beat her. Finally, Ruby could take no more. In January 2007, after 4 years of abuse, Ruby fled from her in-laws' home and returned to her parents' home. Although it may not sound like it, Ruby was lucky. In India, thousands of wives are beaten to death, burned alive, electrocuted, poisoned, pushed out of windows, or killed in some other horrific way because their husbands' families are dissatisfied with the dowries they brought to the marriage. In 2005, one woman was killed over dowry every 77 minutes in India. Now, this is according to the National Crime Records Bureau. In that year alone, 6,787 women were reportedly killed over dowries. Now, the number was certainly higher as some dowry killings were never reported. Dowry killings in India have become so common that there's a nickname for it. It's called bride burning. Now, let me explain. Many kitchen stoves in India are fueled by kerosene. So many newlywed women were doused with kerosene, set on fire, and the cause of their deaths were attributed to kitchen accidents that people jokingly refer to them as bride burnings. During my research, India seemed to be the country with the most extreme example of abuse of the dowry system. In the 1990s, India experienced an economic boom. Incomes and living standards rose for many people. But rather than stemming the tide of dowry-related violence, it exacerbated it. There were more consumer and luxury goods on the market, and people wanted those. From 1995 to 2005, during the economic boom, dowry deaths increased by 46%. Now, you'd think the government would step in and put an end to demanding dowries. Well, in 1961, India's government made it illegal to demand dowries. Unfortunately, the prohibition of dowry demanding was rarely enforced. At first, the intent of the dowry custom seemed to be a positive thing, but in most countries it evolved into something sinister. Maybe one day we'll value our fellow humans not because it may benefit us in some way, but just because they are humans. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and now you know the rest of the story.